Hi guys, and welcome back to the Vice Flies YouTube channel. Today we're going to be going over how to make your flies last longer. Now this is something that's really important that a lot of people, they start off tying flies, they don't really think about how am I going to make this fly last as long as possible. You just want to try and tie the fly as well as you can. And that's totally fine, but you'll come to a point where you're trying to tie flies for going out fishing on one day, you'll tie 3 of those flies. If that's a hard fly to tie, you might only have time to tie 3 of those flies, and as soon as 2 of those are one to lose, one to use, and one to snap, that's always going to happen. You're always going to end up running out of fly. Especially if you're catching quite a lot of fish, you're going to end up having a material that comes loose and the fly won't work as well. So we're going to go over the best materials, best ways to have your flies last as long as possible. Now, the first thing we're going to talk about is wax, beeswax most importantly. Not a lot of people use wax regularly or wax their thread. And the one thing that I would say is wax your thread before applying loose materials. So whether it's dubbing or it's going to be something like a hare's ear thorax, so it's still dubbed, but it's going to be loose. Beeswax is essentially your glue on your thread to tie any loose materials down. Even before putting on CDC, a lot of the time beeswax will keep your CDC in a linear position so that you can tie a thorax over the top of it, or that you can utilize other materials there. Now beeswax is super important. Another place to use beeswax is before you're putting down a whip finish. Beeswax is going to be a really good way to have that whip finish be only a couple of turns deep. You could really have a secure whip finish with some beeswax and some varnish on top of it. That leads us into our next point. Varnish your whip finish every time. A lot of people that are coming in and only varnishing their bodies or their buzzers are totally fine because you'll go over the head. But if you don't varnish your whip finish, you're missing out on the potential to secure that whip finish at an extra level. If that knot comes undone, or you have a particularly vigorous take from a fish that nicks the whip finish, this is going to secure that over the top of any fish nicking that thread, and you won't have that fly come loose. So always varnish your whip finish. Next on top of that is varnish any hard or brittle materials that you're using. So if you look at any of the other videos on this channel, you'll see that whenever we're tying cormorants or any hard-bodied fly, we will always varnish that body. One of the most easily breakable materials to use is soft bodies, kind of like holographic material. Anything that's plastic or synthetic, it can tear quite easily, it can rip, especially on fish like brown trout. They have really sharp, quite large teeth, so if they're tearing across the corner of the mouth when you either hook into that fish or just from fighting that fish, that fly will tear apart quite easily. You could lose the holographic effect on a body in one take. You could have that fly be done after one fish if you don't varnish the body. So varnishing is really important on hard, brittle, quality materials. So I would say at least 1 coat of varnish, if not 2, depending on whether you want the fly to be heavier or not. So be conscious as to whether you're going to actually have that fly sink too fast if it's going to be really heavy. So definitely only varnish in places that it's going to be brittle. Don't varnish loose materials. We'll talk about dry flies for a little bit, because one of the things that people hate about dry flies is how little time they last. Dry flies are not always the easiest to tie, so when we're tying them, we want to make them last as long as possible. Now, the dry fly ability, as we'll call it, is how long is that fly going to stay dry after catching fish. Now, there's definitely 2 ways that you can go about this. You can either apply when you're using the fly. However, that's something that it's time consuming. You also then have to keep reapplying every time that fly gets dry. So we'll do this in a video for sure, but using both gink and silicone mucilin at the tying stage is so important for things like CDC, for things like using polyester for your bob's bits or your shipman's buzzer. There are so many different patterns that you can just use this 2 ingredient combination to make those flies basically unsinkable for the rest of their life, or until you've caught a lot of fish on them and got a good use out of that fly. So by sinking your dry flies in silicone mucilin, letting them dry overnight on a paper towel, and then applying a small amount of gink before going into your box, you're basically securing that that fly will be able to float for a very long period of time. And that will make that fly last much longer. In combination with varnishing any hard body that you've got, varnishing the whip finish, and using beeswax on your whip finishes and your thread, that will make any fly that you're tying last much, much longer. Now, the last thing I'd like to say for getting your flies to last longer is take your time with difficult materials. You have materials like deer hair, that's another dry fly ingredient that you can use this method on. But using things like deer hair can sometimes be very pernickety, very difficult to apply that material to the hook. Take your time. If you're going to rush a step that is crucial to the fly, you have one too many loose turns. As soon as you use that fly a couple of times, that loose turn is going to catch you out. You're going to lose that deer hair. You'll bring in your sedge imitation or whatever, and it'll be completely missing a wing. You'll have no deer hair left on that fly. So make sure you take your time with your patterns and enjoy your tying. As always, if you have any questions or anything else that you'd like to see, then drop a comment down below, and remember to like and subscribe if you like this channel's content. Thanks, guys.